indexing data frames is you can create a new column using the sort of same data frame indexing notation. So all we're going to do is we're going to refer to our gene table data frame up here, and then we're going to name our new column, 3UTR. And I'll warn you, this was a dumb name that I picked. I should have changed it because other languages don't like a number as the first character in your header. So if you load this up into R, it'll add an extra character there. I should have thought about that. But anyway, this is what we named it here. All right, so there's you're going to list your new column right here, and now you're going to use the assignment operator because we're going to assign the output of our calculation to this new column. All right, so there's no create new column command. You say where you want it, and pandas will create it. Right, and so now what did I say? We're subtracting txn, so we have gene table. TXN like this, right? Is that what I did? And minus gene table CDSN. And it's nice, pandas is, whoops, that caps lock there. One thing that's a legitimate operation in these data frames, which is nice, is when if you subtract two numbers, as you saw sort of in the pre-lecture material, you can treat it as a calculator. You can subtract one number from another. Pandas is smart. It recognizes when you have two columns, you can subtract sort of pairwise, one column in one row from another column in another row. And you can do that entire step just by entering this command here. So we'll hit Shift-Enter. And that's the syntax for it. Any questions? We're going to take a look at it. Because you're not seeing really well here? Yeah, let's see. Let's zoom in. How's that? Is that better? Now you can't see all of it. So the trick, you make up a new column and then you assign the output of your function to it. So we can look at it and make sure it worked. There's another thing working with genomic data, whenever you perform an operation, okay, it's hard to see if it worked on all 100,000 at once, although you can put checks in your code to make sure it's correct. But another thing is to just look at it. And so we're going to use this indexing notation here. Right now we've specified our columns. This is just indexing notation here. Now we're going to tell it, we've told it columns, now we're going to tell it rows. And this means from row 0 to 100. Remember, the things start counting at 0. We hit Shift-Enter, and it's going to show us a table of 100 rows here. And so what you can do is sit down with a calculator, another cell in IPython, and check the math. Make sure it's right. And obviously, Python knows how to do subtraction, but who knows that maybe you didn't enter the command correctly. So always go back and see what the output is. How's that? Everybody clear on creating a new column? Indexing, sort of finding your way around these data frames and using indices to specify what you get can be a little tricky. We're going to try another way to do it in Activity 3. But there you go. You have just calculated the 3' UTR lengths of all the genes in the human genome in whatever, it's less than an hour since we started. It's powerful stuff. Very, very, very easy once you figure out what you're doing. Any other questions? Any other parts of this that you want to look at? Everybody good?
So just a question.
Yeah.
This is just the last one we just typed in was saying look at these 3 columns, but only rows 1 through 100. That's correct.
Yeah. Although it's actually, let's see how this comes out. See, as you can see here, the rows start counting at 0, and so it ends on row 99. So
the first one.
Yeah. So beware, right? These in computer science and computers, you start counting at 0. Any other questions? Good? All right. Okay. We're going to get ready to move into Activity 3 here. I just want to show you. So now we've figured out how to load large tables into pandas and work with them. They're represented as these data frame objects. Now let's go back to some of the concepts that were in your homework, and one in particular, load this up here, for loops. So we went over, so in your homework you had to do some simple for loops to calculate sums and means and things like that. A for loop is one of these critical sort of fundamental concepts in programming. So we're going to go over this in a little detail here, because for loops are one of your most powerful tools when you're writing scripts or doing data analysis. All right, so I pulled this out of the homework from class 1, and this is what you had here. Let's see if I break it down. Okay, so basically, and this, I think I've copied this again in the next activity. So let's look at this code a minute from the first class. You use the sum function to sum some data. Remember, the data was just a list of numbers. The sum function gave you the sum, and divided by 5, and it was assigned to the variable named mean. And the next line here, you sort of create an empty variable. Those brackets mean you're creating a variable that will be a list, holds many values at once, called square distances. And then we're in this for loop. This for loop sort of marched through your data, and we'll talk about this here in a second, and calculated the square distances. And then after the for loop was completed, there was a print statement. So let's break this down into a little more detail, what's going on. Because the syntax here can seem a little strange. For item in data. It's not English, obviously. English words, but it's a little weird how it's phrased, and not necessarily intuitive. All right, so we're going to break down a for loop into its parts. Okay? So basically you can think about it this way. There's the for command, there's a temporary variable, in this particular case, you'll see other kinds of for loops, but in a collection of values. Right here. So in black and in bold, these are the parts of the for statement. In the colors, these are variables that you give it. So the collection of values will be a variable. In the previous example, it was data. It was a list of things. And then you give it a name for a variable that's essentially temporary, as you'll see. We call it item in this case. And then what happens, you end with a colon, and inside here, this is called the block. The code inside the block of the loop. You perform some action, and it can just be one line of code, or it can be several lines of code inside of the block. Now, in different programming languages, there are different ways of representing blocks. In Python, we use 4 spaces to indent. That means you're inside the block. All right. What was that? There we go. So basically, a for loop works like this. This simple syntax does these steps here. Step 1, it draws the next item. That was the name of the item in this collection of items. Step 2, it assigns that item to this temporary variable. Now that temporary variable takes the value of the item. Step 3, it then performs these actions on that temporary variable. And then step 4, this is why it's called a loop. It loops back in and goes for the next item. There. And when you run out of items, the loop ends. In this case. Any questions so far? Does that make sense? So it's a simple statement, but actually some complicated things are happening inside. So let's go back to our example and see how this works. So you can see for item, there's our temporary variable. Data is a variable that was, if you recall from the homework, was defined earlier. So let's look here for a minute. Notice I said this is a temporary variable. It's going to be used inside of the for loop. Things that are outside of the for loop are not temporary variables. So what's going to happen? Inside of the for loop, you can actually use both. You can use this item, this temporary variable. You can also use a variable that you can find above, square distances. So what's happening here is it's taking an item out of data, it's assigning it to the variable named item, and then it's performing an action on it. You're subtracting the item from the mean and you're squaring it, and now you're adding it to this other variable here. And it loops through. And so when the for loop expires, when it ends, the variable item disappears. If you tried to type item in there, Python wouldn't find it. But square distances persists. This is just a brief introduction to a much more complex concept called scoping or namespaces. And we will get into that a little in later classes. All right, so now here's a question just to make sure we understand the blocking. What happens, so we have this printed this way, what would happen if we indented the print statement? Think about the for loop there. Man, shout it out if you know what's gonna happen.
It was print for each item.
For each item. And so you would see square distances as you're adding new values to square distances, it would get longer and longer and longer and longer, right? But because it's not indented, it's outside of the loop and it's working on this. All right, so there that was sort of a brief review of for loops that you encountered in your homework. In Activity 3 now, the focus is going to be for loops there. And you're going to use a for loop to calculate now. You've calculated all the lengths of all the 3' UTRs. Now you're going to calculate the average length of the 3' UTR. And we're going to finally answer our question that I posed at the beginning. What's the average length of the 3' UTR of a human gene? Now we're going to use a for loop to figure it out. So, any questions at this point before we proceed? You can go back into your activity notebook and move on to Activity 3. And this should be a little, I'm hoping, although I'm not quite sure, it should be a little shorter than Activity 2. So we should be good. Have at it.